Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenn David Books. The speed and drama with which Kabul collapsed on the 15th of August has raised two fundamental questions that as yet have not been answered. What exactly was Pakistan's role, and what do we know about the personalities and factions that make up the Taliban? My guest today is perhaps one of the few people in the country that has an answer to these critical questions. He retired as Special Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat in charge of RAW. He's Rana Banerji. Mr. Banerji, let me start with a simple question and then we'll build from there. Everyone knows that Pakistan's ISI has played a critical role in funding and also in militarily assisting the Taliban. Most people believe Pakistan also played a role in creating the Taliban. The problem is no one has precise details. So can you begin by giving people an idea of the sort of concrete help the ISI gave the Taliban in these three critical respects?
Thank you, first of all, Karan, for having me on your show. The Taliban actually came into existence in the autumn of 1994 in a mosque known as the White Mosque Sangesar. It's about 50 kilometers from Kandahar. And it was a set of religious devotees who decided to stop certain criminal extortionist gangs which were operating on the highways and harassing a lot of innocent people. There were cases of kidnapping, rape, extortion of goods. So this was effectively stopped by Mullah Omar's gang. Mullah Omar was authorized as the commander of Maulana Abdus Samad, who was technically the first Emir of what later became the Taliban. So they started operating and were fairly successful. And
so at this stage,
yes,
the Taliban was a creation of Afghan people themselves in Kandahar. There was no Pakistani involvement in the creation of Taliban.
That's right. In fact, when the Pakistanis heard about it, there was an official convoy of Pakistani government consignment of trucks which had been halted by a similar gang. And General Nasrullah Babar, who was Interior Minister of the Benazir government then, he decided to take their help and was able to succeed in getting this help. Out of gratitude then, they decided to give Mullah Omar a further bigger role to expand his influence northwards towards Kabul and also eastwards, which was encouraged also by the then Afghan President Burhanuddin Rabbani.
So the Pakistan connection with Taliban began as a result of a fortuitous event. Pakistani trucks were held up, they wanted it to be cleared, they used Mullah Omar and his people to clear it, and in gratitude, they began a relationship.
Yes, they made available access to cache of arms which were hidden in tunnels near Kandahar, which had been intended for use against the Russian invaders. So this was given to Mullah Omar, and also he got money from President Rabbani, according to a well-known Pakistani author.
Why did he get money from Rabbani?
To discipline Hikmatyar, who was nettling Rabbani too much, and Rabbani was dependent for survival on Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was his defense minister. So the whole thing was cracking up already in Kabul.
So in its early days, the Taliban was getting support from Pakistan through Nasrullah Babar, the interior minister, but it also was getting funding from the Afghan government of the day, which is Rabbani's government, or Rabbani himself.
Well, there was a report that there was initial funding of $3 million, of which the Taliban or Mullah Omar's group got only $2 million. $1 million was kept away by an intermediary.
But the interesting thing is in the beginning days, in the early days of the Taliban, it was funded both by Pakistan and by Rabbani, and Rabbani was, by the way, the head of the old Northern Alliance.
That's
and
right.
Massoud was his defense minister.
That's right. So thereafter, the ISI help can be seen in 3 or 4 phases. The Taliban had, or Mullah Omar had come across Colonel Sultan Amir Tarar, who was a former army officer trained by the Americans and also member of the Pakistani Special Services Group, who after retirement had become the Consul General of Herat. So he was roped in to guide and train the Taliban.
By the Pakistanis?
By the Pakistanis. And the entire military training was given by Colonel Sultan Amir Muhammad Tarar, who got the mystical name of Imam.
So Colonel Tarak actually did give military training.
Yes.
Of a pretty formal sort.
Absolutely. And then there was funding continuously by the ISI because they felt in the first phase that they would be able to install the Taliban with some popular support in governance in Kabul. And this is the phase 94 to 96.
When did the Pakistanis move from simply being grateful to the Taliban to funding Taliban and militarily training them and then beginning to think that maybe they could create a government out of Taliban? How long did that take?
A few months only, 94 to 95 I would think. And then 96 the Taliban were ready to move into Kabul. And they were funded and they were assisted militarily with convoys, with actual special services men in commoner garb, accompanying their motorcycles and jeeps when they moved into Kabul.
So when the Taliban actually first in 1996 began their campaign to go straight to Kabul,
yes,
they were funded by the Pakistanis, they were given equipment by the Pakistanis, they were given, I presume, weapons as well.
Yes, and by that time the ISI had lost faith in Hikmatyar, who was their earlier protege, because Hikmatyar was not able to fight sufficiently well.
And the Taliban now got the Pakistan backing instead.
Yes, yes.
And Pakistan, therefore, in a sense could have, you could say, funded, militarily trained the Taliban conquest in the 96 period of Kabul.
Yes. And then we come to the second phase where the actual governance of the Taliban was also assisted by Pakistanis in a very big way. Officers, plainclothes assistants, bureaucrats, they all went there and they helped the Taliban to consolidate in normal bureaucratic governance.
So there were Pakistani officers and bureaucrats actually sitting in Kabul from 96 to 2001 during the 5 years Taliban was ruling.
Yes, not only in Kabul but in the outlying provinces. And when 9/11 happened and the Americans were decided to bomb the hell out of the Taliban or the governance system there was the infamous Kunduz airlift where almost 1,000 to 2,000, the number varies, Pakistani officials, both serving army officers as well as civilian bureaucrats, had to be airlifted out in sorties by the Pakistan Air Force in the knowledge of the Americans.
Absolutely, I remember that period very clearly.
Yes.
We saw pictures on television of Pakistani soldiers now dressed in civilian clothes actually being airlifted out of Kunduz.
That's right.
So in other words, for the 5 years that the Taliban ruled from 96 to 2001, much of the military spine, much of the administrative spine was supplied by Pakistan.
That's right.
So you could say that not only did Pakistan finance the first, in quotes, conquest of Kabul by the Taliban in 96, but then they in a sense provided the backbone for the government.
Certainly.
So the Taliban could not have ruled for that 5-year period without all the help and support they got from Pakistan.
That's right. And of course there were figurehead leaders who were religious leaders who were put in positions as a defense minister or any other minister. So there was a shura which actually was seen to be governing the country.
But the real governance was Pakistani officials.
Well, they also learnt their ropes, the Taliban leaders.
But the Pakistani were there behind closed doors.
Them. Yes, yes.
Tell me, what sort of support did Pakistan give the Taliban from 2001 when they were thrown out by the Americans from Kabul right up till 2021?
Again, this has to be seen in 3 phases, if I may put it. The first phase was the withdrawal phase, when they were determined to quickly save as many assets of theirs and asked them to lie low and settle down in various places in Pakistan. And these were the areas which were not so much well in the limelight, the federally administered tribal areas where the Miram Shah Shura took shape. And then there was the Peshawar refugee camps where the Peshawar Shura of the Taliban was set up. And then there were outskirts of Quetta, there was another refugee camp there where the Quetta Shura was set up.
So in each of these 3 instances, the Pakistan government found sanctuaries and helped the Taliban settle there and create a second life for themselves now that they've been thrown out of Kabul.
In this work also they helped the escape of Osama bin Laden from first Kandahar to Tora Bora caves and from Tora Bora into Pakistan. And in this transition, Jalaluddin Haqqani the Haqqani network head or tribal chief came to their assistance in a major way. And Jalaluddin Haqqani, many people forget, was also an American asset, acknowledged to be a CIA asset earlier.
He just changed sides.
No, he remained with the Americans.
So he was a double agent in a sense.
Yes.
Fascinating. Tell me something. In the first phase after 2001, the Pakistanis found sanctuaries and helped the Taliban settle in Miramshah, in Quetta, in Peshawar.
Yes.
What did they do in the second stage and the third stage?
In the second stage, you see, Musharraf had come to power and the double dealing with the Americans started in real earnest. There were also a lot of Arabs, Uzbeks and Chechen rebels, Tajik Islamic rebel outfits which had come along with Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Jawahiri. And Jalaluddin Haqqani himself had an Arab wife apart from his Afghan wife. So one of his sons, Nasir, who was later killed, he was in charge of handling all the funds, the Hawala funds which used to come from.
But you're saying in the second stage, the Pakistanis
Yes.
provided protection,
Yes.
not just to the Taliban, but to this collection of Uzbek, Arab, Tajik
Yes.
militants or jihadis who'd come across with Taliban.
That's right. And that is when also the phenomenon of the Tehrik-e-Taliban developed, particularly in the FATA, the tribal areas, which were ruled at that time by the frontier crimes.
But this should have worried the Pakistanis.
Sorry?
This should have worried the Pakistanis that the Taliban from Afghanistan were now under their protection creating a Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan.
It didn't worry them even initially because they felt they had everything under their control.
Which they didn't eventually.
Which they didn't eventually because in the process what happened, the Maliki system, which had withstood from the British times, where there used to be a tribal elder as the Malik in that area, and he was assisted by a civil servant who was designated a political agent in these areas, their writ stopped running, and it was the Maulanas and the well-funded clerics in these areas who became more power brokers. They had guns and they started to.
Now, the first stage you've established is when Pakistan found sanctuaries and settled the Taliban
That's right.
in Quetta, in Miramshah, and in Peshawar. What sort of financing did they give them thereafter? What sort of facilities for military training did they give them? What sort of protection did they give them? Can you tell me about that quickly?
Well, there aren't too many details about the funding, how it went, but the one thing is for certain, the drug smuggling from these areas, both by the land route through Karachi and also through the land route into Iran and then into Western Europe, was manipulated by the Taliban to collect funds on their own.
But protected by the Pakistanis?
To a certain extent, in the terms of customs and excise, etc. There are documentation of this in the BBC documentary called Traffic.
So in other words, the Pakistanis did not stop it happening.
Did not stop it happening.
What sort of other financial facilities did they give Taliban from 2001 to 2021?
Well, again, you see this, mainly these were Hawala transactions to which they turned their blind eye. But 2004 onwards, the Taliban started resurging in a major way because of malgovernance in Afghanistan by the Karzai regime.
And what did the Pakistanis do then?
They assisted them to go into these areas which were ungoverned, particularly in the fringe
So
belt
the Pakistanis
into
were then
Afghanistan.
pushing the Taliban
Yes.
across the border
Yes.
back into Afghanistan.
They helped them to control these areas, and there were local field commanders who were fighting the Afghan National Security Forces at this
Did the
time.
Pakistanis supply food? Did they supply equipment? Did they supply weapons?
Everything, and also rest and recreation facilities. If the commanders used to get injured, they would take them to the hospitals inside Pakistan, in Karachi or in Balochistan.
So in other words, the Pakistani government or the Pakistani authorities allowed the Taliban to use Pakistan as their deep base,
Safe haven.
as their safe haven, from which they could go back,
Yes.
get supplies, get treatment if they were injured,
Yes.
and then with Pakistani assistance, go back to Afghanistan and carry on fighting.
And new towns, boom towns developed outside Peshawar, known as the University Town in Peshawar. And similarly, I think Jafrabad or Pashtunabad in Quetta. There was another township almost developed in Quetta, just outside Quetta, where they bought up properties, new houses, etc. The leaders of the
So
Taliban.
tell me, Mr. Banerjee, did this sort of assistance continue from 2004 all the way to 2021, or were there stages when it got stepped up and Pakistani involvement, ISI involvement, funding and training became more and more?
It's difficult to say if that happened, but what is of relevance is that the Americans were all through aware of this, that this was happening, and the Americans were trying basically to attain their one objective, to find out where Osama bin Laden is hidden or has disappeared into, and the Americans tried to interact with the Taliban to cause defections from within the senior Taliban leadership in collaboration with or in the knowledge of the Pakistan ISI.
But so the Americans were well aware that the Pakistanis were funding, supporting, protecting, equipping and giving weapons to the Taliban, pushing them across the border, allowing the Taliban to use Pakistan as a safe haven when they get injured, but did nothing. They just winked at it right through the period.
Well, there was supposed to be intelligence cooperation to find out high value assets, and the understanding was that the Pakistanis would tell the Americans about the movement of high value assets, Arabs, Syrians, etc., and they would then be eliminated by
which
American
Pakistan
drones.
Occasionally did, but nowhere near sufficiently, because Osama remained protected right up till 2011.
In time the Americans found out that the information that they were giving to them was being leaked a few days in advance to the terrorists themselves.
I don't want to get lost in the detail of this section, but I think this section is very important because it explains the 20-25 year background of Pakistani support and involvement with the Taliban. However, let me now come to the present time. When the Taliban on the 15th of August literally dramatically swept into Kabul and took over, there are some people who say that was the culmination of a second Pakistani invasion or conquest of Kabul, once again fronted by the Taliban. You agreed that when the Taliban took power in 96, this description applied. Does it apply again in 2021?
This time everybody was a little surprised at the manner in which the Afghan National Security Forces collapsed. Yes. Nobody expected it to happen with the speed that it did.
But could the Taliban have done it, and certainly at the speed at which they did, without the support, assistance, training from Pakistan?
They may not have, but what contributed more was the morale loss of the Afghan National Security Forces, the announcement of the American ground forces withdrawal.
So that description, a Pakistani invasion fronted by the Taliban, applied in 96. You don't think it applies equally in 2021?
Perhaps not equally, yes.
Okay, let me put this to you. On the very day that the Taliban entered and swept through Kabul, 15th of August 2021, some of the most important leaders of the Northern Alliance, who were opponents of Pakistan, flew to Islamabad to seek safety, security and assurances from the Pakistan government. And these included Ahmad Shah Massoud's brothers and important Hazara leaders like Halili and Muhakkik. If opponents of Pakistan are going to Pakistan to seek its support, sanctuary and safety, isn't that a sure sign that Pakistan has become very important and very powerful in this part of the world?
Well, yes, that's a way of looking at it. Also, it included also Yunus Qanuni, a former speaker of the parliament. Now, all these players were very relevant actors of the Northern Alliance when in 1997. But this time they could see the writing on the wall in the manner in which they had no other options.
And they sought support and succor from someone who was their, in quotes, enemy.
Basically for survival and safety of their lives. And there was the fig leaf of, wanting to have Pakistani intercession for, having inclusive governance.
But this is the point I'm making. At the end of the day, opponents of Pakistan, the Northern Alliance, were seeking safety and security of their own lives from Pakistan. This is why I say to you, isn't this a sign of how influential and powerful Pakistan has become once the Taliban took over a second time?
Yes, that is why there is so much of triumphalism, because both the Pakistan army and the Pakistan geostrategic terms, Pakistan civilian leadership believe that they have achieved their primary objective of their entire policy of supporting the Taliban, that is to keep Indian influence out from Afghanistan for a foreseeable future.
And proof of that is that their opponents, Ahmad Shah Massoud's brothers, the Hazara leaders Khalid and Muhakkik, are now knocking on Pakistan's doors to say, help us, support us, save us.
Yes, that would be one way of looking at it.
Let me at this point come to the second big issue I want to discuss with you. Up till now, we've talked about Pakistan's role in funding, in training, in militarily supporting the Taliban right through the 25 years from 1995-96 up till 2021. Let me now talk to you about the personalities and factions that make up the Taliban. Its present Emir is a man called Haibatullah Akhundzada. What do we know about him, and why is he never seen and heard?
Well, he's a Nurzai from Panjwai, which is a district in Kandahar. His father was a religious cleric, head of a mosque in Kandahar. He himself was a middle, low-level official in the judicial Qazi court system of the first Taliban dispensation, known to be a fairly religious, modest, low-profile person. He was selected as a sort of patchwork unity among various factions and to be kept firmly under control of the ISI, because the previous Emir had, Mullah Mansoor, had become too high profile. So
this is very interesting. Akhundzada was chosen as a patchwork choice, both by different factions. In other words, he was, I presume, everyone's number 2, no one's number 1 choice. But he was also chosen because he was acceptable to the ISI. His predecessor had, in a sense, stood up to the ISI, and the ISI didn't want someone like that again.
That's right. Though it's not been clearly established. Iran had meddled with the Taliban, and the former Emir had become friendly with the Iranians, which was not to the liking of the Pakistanis.
Akhundzada's predecessor.
Yes, Mullah
That's
Mansoor.
another reason why the ISI didn't like him.
Yes.
So, in other words, this was a lowest common denominator choice. Is that right?
That's right.
Why is he never seen and heard?
He is by temperament like that, and he adopted a very consensual style of leadership among various factions, so nobody really complained much. And also there was an incident 2 years into his tenure when his brother, who was also a preacher in a mosque in Kuchlak near Quetta, was killed in a bomb explosion. And the story goes that maybe there were some of his rivals who were trying to get at Akhundzada himself, because he used to go there to pray also.
But tell me, he was, as you say, the lowest common denominator. He was everyone's number 2, no one's number 1 choice. But now that he's been there 5-6 years, is he accepted and acknowledged as the head, as the Emir, or are there still people who question his position?
No, he is more or less not questioned as an Emir, because he's kept to a very proper religious profile, which was similar to that of Mullah Omar himself, though Mullah Omar had a different stature.
So his religiosity
Yes.
has helped secure his position.
Possibly.
What role will he play when the Taliban form a government in Kabul? Will he head the government, or do you believe he'll seek a role above the government as supreme leader, something similar to Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran?
Well, the parallel doesn't quite apply, but the parallel of Mullah Omar himself may be used.
Which is?
Which is Mullah Omar never took power himself. He preferred to remain in Kandahar, and he left the governance to a leadership council. A similar type of thing may happen with the 3 deputies parceling out actual real political power among themselves.
If this happens, in whose hand will be, to use that Indian phrase, the remote control? Who will actually have power?
Well, the ISI will, and the major exponent of that power implementing it would be Sirajuddin Haqqani.
So, regardless of who is president and regardless who is supreme leader, if they create that post, the ISI will have real power, and they will operate through Sirajuddin Haqqani, their favorite faction of the Taliban.
That's right. But this could change. You see, these calculations could change because of the ambitions of both Mullah Biradar himself and Mullah Yaqub, the son of Mullah
Let's come to
Omar.
Mullah Biradar first. We'll come to Mullah Yaqub after that.
Okay.
Now, he's one of the 3 deputy commanders. He has spent 8 years in detention in Pakistan, but he was also the critical key interlocutor for the talks with the Americans in Doha.
That's right.
Tell me more about him.
Well, he's a Popalzai, which is one of the blue-blooded tribes of the Afghan dynasty, the Durrani dynasty. So, in the caste system that they have in their tribal society,
He's at the top.
he is among the people at the top. Whereas Mullah Omar himself was a Hotak, a slightly lower in the pecking order of Ghilzais. But there is a story not confirmed of Mullah Omar's wife and Mullah Biradar's wife being co-brothers-in-law. So that is why he called him brother. and that's where he got his name of Mullah Baradar.
So the name Baradar, which is
Could have-
Farsi for brother,
Yes.
is actually a name given by Mullah Omar
To him.
someone who you think might have been a brother-in-law.
That's right. It's never been proved because
Tell me more about Mullah Baradar.
yes. Now, in 2008, he tried to establish links with President Karzai and also was amenable to the idea of talking to the Americans. And this was not to the liking of the ISI.
Is that why he was detained?
That's right.
And he spent roughly 8 years in detention.
Almost 10 years. Well, 2010 to 2018.
Khalilzad apparently pressed on the Pakistanis to release him.
That's right.
And he then became the head of the talks at Doha.
Not immediately. Initially, he was in a drug stupor state, and he's seen to have recovered from that, or allowed to recover, because while in detention, he was supposed to be in very much of a depressed and drugged state. He couldn't make out his bearings and things like that.
Drugs because he was being given drugs by the Pakistanis, or
Maybe.
because he had become a druggie himself?
No. I mean, maybe because he was being given drugs to keep him in good humor or whatever.
Now, the Western press often speculates that Mullah Baradar could be the president whenever the government is set up. Do you think that's likely?
That is possible, yes, because now he has been fairly savvy in the diplomatic dialogue that has gone on in Doha, where there are very many other both hardliners and both retainers of the ISI very closely under their supervision,
But he's
who are
handled-
also in the dialogue team.
But he's handled this very
He's
well.
handled all that very well.
So he's shown the ability to keep together different factions of hardliners and softer people that exist within the Taliban framework.
Possible.
What about Mullah Yaqub, who is the other deputy commander
Yes.
and is in fact Mullah Omar's son?
Yes, he's much younger, and he has been in touch with some other field commanders who have actually been involved in the fighting. People like Ibrahim Sadr, who has now been made the interior minister, and Mullah Zakir, who has now been made the defense
Is he
minister.
a rival of Baradar, or do they get on with each other?
That's not known. Ultimately, because he is younger to Baradar, he has the lineage of Omar. He would like to be anointed heir eventually, but
also
he has to contend with Sirajuddin Haqqani's ambition.
You're also suggesting that Mullah Yaqub has better links with the fighting branches of the Taliban. Baradar has better links with the negotiating political branches.
Well, yes, you can say that in a way.
Where into all of this does Zahabuddin Masjid fit in?
Zabiullah Mujahid.
Yeah, where does he fit in? He is clearly the television face of the Taliban as a result of his press conferences, and it's his comments that have led people to talk about the possibility of Taliban 2.0. But is he critical and important, or is he just a spokesman?
He is just a spokesman. One of three, in fact, who have been used by the Taliban in the past.
The other being Sohail Shaheen.
Sohail Shaheen and one other person. They had been parcel different areas to which they would deal. But Zabiullah possibly has the most photogenic face, and he seems to have become more politically savvy of late. So that is why he has now been entrusted with the initial forays.
But he's not one of the critical
No, he
top
was
leaders.
a middle level or junior level official in the culture ministry of the first Taliban dispensation.
So he's a middle level Taliban person who's acquired a lot of prominence because he's fronting the press conferences and because he has a manner and perhaps, as you put it, a photogenic face that attracts attention and gets remembered.
And an example of this is when he was asked the ticklish question in the press conference about the visit of the CIA chief William Burns, he stepped aside and asked the foreign office official of the Taliban to answer the question, which was of course replied to in a very non-committal manner.
Now, the faction that is perhaps of great interest to India is what's called the Haqqani faction.
That's right.
Tell me about them. The Haqqanis are often considered the brutal, tough, fighting wing of the Taliban. Mike Mullen, the former American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called them the veritable arm of the ISI.
Yes.
And as you said, not only do they have connections with the ISI, but Jalaluddin Haqqani was once upon a time, your words were, almost an agent of America.
That's
so
right.
they play the game on both sides.
Perhaps not anymore, because they have designated Sirajuddin as a terrorist in their own 2012 order.
But Sirajuddin is also the third of the three deputy commanders of the Taliban,
That's
along
right.
with Mullah Yaqub and Mullah Baradar.
That's right. The other two are not designated so far.
So
But
tell me more about the Haqqani group.
yes. Now, Jalaluddin's sons, there were many sons, 7 sons. 3 or 4 of them got killed in the US reprisals, drone attacks, or in the actual fighting. But Nasir and Siraj and Badruddin, these were the three most important sons. Now, Badruddin got killed. Siraj also got killed in an ordinary crime in 2013 in Islamabad. But the Islamabad police was not allowed to make any investigations about the murder. His body was carried in a VIP convoy to the tribal areas and given a decent
This
burial.
is further proof of the link between Pakistan, ISI and the Haqqani group.
Yes, yes. So is Touch Me Not. And there is of course the fictional serial of the Homeland 4 serial where you have the Haqqani group attacking the US embassy in Islamabad and going into their cipher room and all that.
And as you said at the beginning, the Haqqani group are the favored, preferred faction of the Taliban for the ISI.
For the ISI. And we have suffered at their hands in the sense that their attack on our embassy in Kabul, where we lost one diplomat and one defense personnel, was directly planned, executed by
So
them.
does most of ISI funding, most of ISI military equipment that goes to the Taliban actually go to the Haqqani group within the Taliban?
There is no definite evidence about that.
But you suspect so?
I would think so, yes.
But the interesting thing is that the Haqqani group only merged with the Taliban in the mid-90s after the Taliban had come to power the first time round. And there are also stories that although Jalaluddin Haqqani was a minister in the first Taliban government, Karzai is reported to have tried to reach out to him and involve him in Karzai's government. Karzai didn't succeed, but it's reported that those attempts were made. How close are the bonds that bind the Haqqani group to the rest of the Taliban? Or are there differences and cracks there?
Well, there are individual ambitions and differences, but everybody is afraid of this Haqqani faction. Even the Taliban leaders themselves may be afraid of them because of the patronage they enjoy from the ISI and because of the use of suicide bombs with great facility by them, which is well known. To exterminate their opponents inside Afghanistan. So most of these bombings, etc., were being done by the Haqqani faction.
So the Haqqani faction, in a sense, has intimidated other leaders in the Taliban.
That could be. Though in time, you see, if the families and the children of other Taliban leaders come out of Pakistan and they no longer require rest and recreation facilities,
that could change.
This relationship could change.
That will be in the future.
Because
but up till now, the relationship has been one where the Haqqanis, because of the support, funding from Pakistan, have somewhat intimidated the rest of the Taliban.
That's true. One other reason is that they are Zadranj. They are from an area called Zadran, which is lower eastern Paktiya coast, Nangarhar. In the tribal, again, caste systems, the Zadranj are the lowest among the...
Why would that help them intimidate others?
Not intimidate, but to be looked down upon by other blue-blooded Afghan
But now you're
tribals.
contradicting yourself. If they're looked down upon, then they won't intimidate and frighten people.
At a later date, I said, it could happen.
Let me put this to you. It's reported that two Haqqani brothers, Khalil and Anas, are now responsible for security in Kabul today. If that's true, what does it suggest?
Khalil is said to be an uncle, also not perhaps a direct uncle, a cousin of Jalaluddin, and much younger, of course, than Jalaluddin. But Anas, of course, is one of his younger sons, and he was under detention for a while.
But if security is in their hands, what does this suggest?
This could have been a temporary measure. Now they have appointed a new
acting governor,
a mayor,
so
and also an intelligence chief.
So this story that security was in the hands of the Haqqanis, Anas and Khalil, is not a worrying factor. It was built up by the press as a moment of concern, but you're saying it's not necessarily so.
Possibly. I mean, you have now an appointee, unless he has aligned now with the Haqqanis, Mullah Najibullah, who has been made the intelligence chief of this new government. And he was known to be closer to the Dadullah faction, which was not close to the Haqqanis in the good old days.
You're confusing us with detail. What is the point you're making?
We don't know whether the intelligence chief appointee is definitely a Haqqani man.
Okay, so in other words, the regime that is forming, to the extent we can see, is not necessarily under Haqqani control.
It could be an eclectic regime.
It could be an eclectic regime. And the point you're therefore reinforcing is that the initial belief that because Anas Haqqani was in Kabul, Khalil Haqqani was in Kabul, and it was reported that Haqqanis controlled Kabul security, that initial belief may be questionable.
Yeah, it could change. Relations could.
Let's come very briefly to the situation in Afghanistan as it's begun to emerge during the last 10-11 days. I believe the Director General of the ISI flew to Kandahar while Mullah Banerji was there, and they were seen together praying at a mosque. There are also reports that Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi spent a day or two in Kabul, but he himself has denied it. But what does all of this suggest about the role Pakistan is playing in helping put together a Taliban government?
Well, they would definitely like to remain very close to whatever leadership emerges among the Taliban.
And are they pulling the strings?
They
from the
would
back?
definitely be pulling the strings, and they would be trying to make it a pleasant phenomenon. And particularly Mullah Banerji, having had this experience of detention in a Pakistani jail, he would be very sensitive to such behavior.
But then
they're
therefore
going
there
the
will
extra
be
mile.
so. But then therefore there will be problems, because the Pakistanis want to pull the strings and ensure that their chosen people have critical posts.
Yes.
But Mullah Banerji, who has been in detention at the hands for 8 years,
Yes,
will want to ensure that in fact Pakistan's role is limited. There are tensions here now.
they could develop later in the sense that the Taliban leadership will not immediately put red rag to the Pakistani bull.
They have already appointed acting ministers of
That's
defense, an acting minister of the interior, as well as, I believe, an acting foreign minister. They've also appointed
Finance minister.
a finance minister, my
That's right.
apologies. And they've also appointed an acting governor and an acting mayor. Now, are these people you suspect that the Pakistanis have put in place, or are they independent, credible people who have support within the Taliban? Which of the two?
I think it is the latter, because they have already played a reasonably well-known role in the actual fighting on the ground. And earlier they had not been accommodated to the extent that they had committed in the actual fighting.
So they are getting their rewards now.
Possibly. But this is something that one cannot assert for certain.
But you're
at this
also
stage.
saying something else. Your sense, your hunch is these are not Pakistani puppets being put in place. These are people with a credible track record of their own.
Yes, and the Taliban must have convinced the ISI that they have to accommodate them for the unity of the whatever leadership shura
But now this is
eventually
very
emerges.
interesting. Not so long ago, you were talking about how the remote control will be in ISI hands.
It
that
will still
regardless,
be. It
but now what you're saying suggests that that remote control isn't working, because the Taliban is convincing the ISI that the people who we're placing in acting positions are not necessarily your chosen ones, they're the people we're rewarding because they've done good work.
Well, you see, ISI would know much more about the inner faction pressures and pulls that the Taliban are faced with. So they would concur in only those things in which they are comfortable with.
Okay.
So they would know more than us about what is happening within the Taliban.
So what you see may not necessarily be the truth. The surface may suggest
Yeah,
these
this is
people are independent.
This is
The
an
strings are
analysis
still
from
there.
a distance of a person who's retired from intelligence analysis 10 years down the line.
Let me put this to you. We've seen last week images of Karzai and Abdullah talking to Anas Haqqani, talking to the Pakistani ambassador in Kabul, and there were reports in the Western press that Abdullah and Karzai could play some sort of role in shaping a government, perhaps smoothing the way for the Taliban. Is that your understanding as well?
No, they may have tried to give that impression, but the Taliban went through the motions of engaging with them, and these impressions have been since dispelled despite efforts still being made by Karzai, maybe not so much by Abdullah, to give this impression, because Karzai at one stage, if you recall, had been the foreign minister of the Mujahideen. He fell
Deputy Foreign Minister.
Deputy Foreign Minister. He fell out because his father was murdered in a Kandahar mosque in a plot which he believed had been hatched by the ISI.
So in other words, this initial impression of last week that Karzai and Abdullah were playing a role in trying to shape or help the Taliban is actually one that Abdullah and Karzai were fostering. The Taliban was simply going through the polite motions of meeting former leaders as a courtesy, nothing more.
Yes, and to give the impression to the West that maybe they are serious about having an inclusive setup, and they wouldn't mind that if your recognition was on the way. But after that, we have had the visit of the American CIA chief, who had a direct one-to-one meeting with Mullah Banerji.
And Karzai and Abdullah were not there.
They were
There
definitely
are also
not.
reports.
Karzai's guards were disarmed in his palace that he was staying in, the presidential palace. So he had to move with his family to Abdullah's house.
Yeah, what does that suggest? That move from his own home to Abdullah's house to seek
Insecurity. That may be why my guards have been disarmed.
So that entire picture that was presented both in the Western press and the Indian press, that Karzai and Abdullah playing a critical role, is actually done more by Karzai and Abdullah to build their own image. The Taliban was simply being respectful, they were getting in touch out of politeness, but they don't treat these people as serious.
I don't think they are going to share power very easily
with them. Now, it's roughly 11 or 12 days since the 25th when the Taliban came to Kabul. They still haven't formed a government. I know they've set up acting ministers, finance, defense, interior. They've got an acting governor and mayor of Kabul. They say they will only form a proper government after the 31st when foreign soldiers have left. Do you believe that? Or are there problems in forming a government, and is this just an excuse?
No, I think they are playing for time, for international recognition. Once they get that, then they will actually declare the Emirat, and then the leadership council will
But
take
can
shape.
they get international recognition if there isn't a government to recognize?
Well, they want to have an Emirat, and they're still toying with the idea of what sort of constitution they are going to accept. The 1964 constitution is being held out to them as a possible compromise document.
But that is the Zahir Shah constitution.
Yes, but it's work in progress if they have some Islamic clauses into that. If the recognition
But the
is
Zahir Shah
forthcoming-
constitution had a kingship, so do you see the emirate becoming a kingship?
No, the emirate will have to be given some recognition in whatever form, Sharia law and the emirate. So that is what they are working at.
So this delay in
not
forming
happening.
a government is playing for time. It's not an indication that they're having problems.
Initially that seemed to be so, but now with the announcement of these designations, I would tend to...
My last question, how seriously do you take the resistance in the Panjshir? Can Amrullah Saleh and Ahmad Shah Massoud's son actually threaten the Taliban? Or is it only a matter of time before the Taliban vanquishes them?
Yes, they cannot really threaten, but surrender may not happen immediately.
What about defeat?
Defeat also may not happen immediately because Panjshir has always been well defended. It's their capability to attack and take on more areas from where they are, that's in dispute. And that is why the Taliban feel it's not a serious problem.
So Panjshir, because of its geographical locations surrounded by these mountains, can defend itself, but it's very unlikely that the resistance in Panjshir will be able to spread beyond the borders of Panjshir.
There could be some political accommodation also with Ahmad Massoud, because he has a sort of charisma which the Taliban may not want to totally ignore. But his deputy or the former vice president, the acting president, Amrullah Saleh, is never going to make his peace with the Taliban.
We end now with me repeating to you one question. You do believe no matter what government is formed, at the end of the day, the hand of the ISI will be there behind it. Even if the Taliban find credible faces of their own, the strings will be in ISI hands.
For a considerable while, yes.
How long is a considerable while?
Anything between 6 months to a year at least.
But after a year, the government could begin to break free.
It would depend on the safe havens, where their children are, where their families, what they do with their properties in Pakistan. If they can have better sanctions or options available to them inside Afghanistan, then...
So in other words, if the world wants the Taliban to loosen the strings that attach them to the ISI, we need to find ways of helping them with their sons and their properties so that they can establish independence and separation.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. This has been a comprehensive interview. You've given us incredible detail. I'm not sure everyone will be able to follow all of it, but for those who care both about the history and the details of the Pakistani involvement and the ISI in particular with the Taliban, and those who also want to know who are the factions and who are the personalities within the Taliban, you've been like an encyclopedia. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Banerji. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.